Stephanie, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you, Al?
I'm
Thanks for
doing
having me.
really well. I'm really excited to be talking with you, and I'm really excited to see you in person again next week there in Austin. So this is kind of a
Yes.
preamble for that. But we're going to talk about hybrid work strategies and some other things. But before we get into it, you mind introducing yourself and sharing a little bit about what you're doing there at Dell?
Yes, of course. So I'm Stephanie Murphy. That dog you heard in the background is Twist. He's my youngest pup. I have an older one named Oliver, and so Oliver and Twist. But I'm Stephanie Murphy. I work at Dell Technologies. I've been leading our people insights and assessments over the last couple of years. Practiced at Dell in 2014. Kind of fell in love with the people and the culture and spent the majority of my career there. I got my master's and PhD in IO psychology, so focused on just making the workplace better for our team members. So within my team, we own research, we own employee listening, and we own our assessment strategy for the company.
All right. Well, there's a lot that you have been doing across the employee life cycle. And one of the themes that you and I talked about recently is hybrid work. And I know you have some, call them myth busters, that you'd like to share, as well as some current trends. So you want to jump into this and share a little bit about. And by the way, if you're listening and joining on LinkedIn, by all means, enter your comments and questions in the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can. But with that, Stephanie, all you.
Yeah, happy to jump in here. So one of the fun things that we like to do at Dell is what we call myth busters. And so it's taking a lot of some of those external trends and topics that we hear and figuring out what does that actually look like at Dell and how do we kind of showcase to our leaders and to our senior leadership team what's different about Dell that might be showing up in some of these external trends. And so with the kind of move to hybrid work, we saw this as a really good opportunity to take a step back and figure out, what does hybrid work look like at Dell? And so Dell has been hybrid since for the last 13, 14 years. So we were ahead of the game with a lot of companies where we had already kind of built a culture and an infrastructure that allowed us to really be hybrid a lot faster than a lot of companies. And we did a lot of research in the past between remote workers and non-remote workers and found no differences. And so wanted to kind of take that to the next step. And so as you can see here on the slide, all the trends and research out there about kind of the chaotic landscape and remote work may, have more problems with inclusion, returned off at mandates are outdated, and the kind of just, it's a chaotic landscape. And so we wanted to use data and kind of our people analytics team to kind of look at, well, what are our team members saying? What does our data say? And drive our hybrid work strategy in a way that is more consistent with what's specific to Dell.
Can I pause you right there? Because that is, I think, a really important call out and approach just from the get go. Because I see many leaders, and it's featured in the popular press, as you just highlighted, where they're either like informing their decision based on their gut, what they believe is their own truth based on their experience, sample size of one, or they're being influenced by articles in the popular press. Well, if so and so is doing that, therefore I should be doing that. What I hear you doing is forming an approach that's appropriate for the people and systems that you're responsible for at this point in time. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. And a lot of this is due to we are in a very unique situation where our CHRO is also an IO psychologist. So she values the need for data and the kind of making data driven decisions. And she sets that standard for our HR function. And so when we make decisions, she's the first one to ask, where's the data? Where's the research? Where's the science? And so there's no different with our hybrid work strategy there.
Well, with that, so if you have that kind of sponsorship, is that a mindset that's been an approach, data-driven approach, call it, that has permeates not only HR, but the customers of HR?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's been something that our business leaders have seen and noticed the difference of how we're approaching things. And they also ask for the data too, all the way up to Michael. I just posted something on my LinkedIn recently where Michael made a comment about how anything that's new or exciting in the world right now, data is at the back end of that. And so it's been a really big culture for Dell to be data driven.
And I'm sorry, who's Michael? I'm just kidding.
We're on a first name basis, if you didn't
Yeah,
realize.
yeah, just me and Mikey. Um, so so I know you have these. So tell me about the myths that you had to go bust. What are some of those?
Yeah, and so that next slide kind of talks about one of them, but there's a ton of them. And so this was just one when you think about inclusion, right? And so one of the things people have said, and we've heard leaders and kind of seen posts about, like, you can't figure out inclusion in this hybrid world. What does inclusion look like? A lot of companies since the murder of George Floyd have been focusing on inclusion. And so there's been these kind of twin crises where you're trying to figure out DEI at the same time, you're trying to figure out hybrid work. And so research out there says, employees do not feel their organizations are diverse and inclusive. DEI efforts help put tech industry still in the tech industry still are falling short. Women of color have a preference where they don't want her to return to the office. So when you're putting these mandates in there, you're isolating a group of people that don't want to go into an office when you're mandating come in 2 days a week. And so one of the things we looked at was, okay, what does inclusion look like at Dell? What are our team members actually telling us as we are in a hybrid working environment? And when we say hybrid, we mean that everyone has flexibility of choice. I might have team members that choose to be fully remote. I might have team members that choose to go into the office a couple of days a week. I might have team members that choose to be fully in an office. We allow that flexibility. And so I think there's some people, when they say hybrid, they mean people are coming in 2 days a week, or that's a mandate where you come in at least a couple of days. Dell's not like that. We provide that more flexible of choice. And when we see in our results is that our team members still feel like we have an inclusive environment. And I think a lot of it ties to the fact that we allow people that flexibility to do what makes them feel most safe and most comfortable.
There's a bunch of questions that jump for me in that statement because you have number one, an open-minded approach to appreciate people where they are and honor their needs. With that in mind, what does inclusion mean? Do you have a definition? Do you have a set of survey items, for example, or other metrics that indicate whether or not people are feeling included?
Yeah, so similar to a lot of companies after the murder of George Floyd, we did that kind of deep look at ourselves, right? And kind of we looked at our culture code, we looked at we have 5 values and 7 principles. And one of the things that we did was we made sure each one of our values and principles have behaviors in them that are about inclusion, whether that be about sponsorship, whether that be about kind of fostering active listening and making sure everyone has a voice on the team. And so all of our values and principles have at least one behavior that's focused on fostering and building diverse and inclusive teams. And then we measure in our employee engagement survey, we measure our leaders on that. We have about 10 or so questions that we call our inclusion category that leaders have within their reports that all 12,000 leaders get. And we ask them to have conversations with their teams about those scores.
Oh my gosh. I just wanna jump through the screen and hug you, and I'll hug you next week. So if you're
Yes,
good with it.
lots of hugging.
Because I just wanna to call this out because there have been many organizations over the years, that I've been a professional where there are stated and communicated values, yet what's being asked in an engagement survey, for example, doesn't marry up with, what is being pushed out, by leadership. A lot of times there was an allergy to that because it created accountability where there was no accountability before. And so what I'm hearing you say when you talk about behaviors, that it's not only to put it on the wall and communicate it, it's like, okay, we're measuring against this, and not, again, this is my own narrative, so correct me if I'm wrong, not in a punitive, way, but hopefully in a celebratory way that, hey, you're trending well, and if things aren't not optimal, then here are resources to improve. Is that the way you look and approach it? And it also invites the question: to what level do you go in the organization to promote this inclusive environment across the enterprise?
Yeah, so our employee engagement survey is probably a little bit different than a lot of folks in terms of it's a part of our culture. We call it a signature practice. We get over 90% response rate on each on our employee engagement survey across all the company. And then all 12,000 of our leaders get reports, and they're expected to have conversations. And so leaders are held accountable to have those conversations with their team. And so through that, by adding the inclusion questions within that, we're now having these inclusive leaders. All leaders are expected to have these inclusion conversations. And then if they have low scores, we provide tons of resources and then consultations that can be had to help them improve. And then we highlight leaders that have positive scores, that have high ones. We call them Dell rock stars, when leaders have really good scores. So it's rewarding and kind of providing the resources for those that have low scores, but rewarding those with the high scores as well.
Well, a question came in from Lydiana, put it right here if you can see it. What are the questions addressing inclusion? Do you mind sharing, if not specifically, something that exemplifies what those questions look like or what they get after?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, we asked a ton of different questions. Like I mentioned, I think our index is about 10 or so, but we also have ones that are not in the index of like, what are some of the behaviors your leader is doing that you feel like are inclusive or foster inclusive behaviors so they can continue those behaviors. We ask about if your leader understands issues that affect you. I think one of the things that the pandemic has kind of set up or added to the mix of leadership is we kind of like we now see people as people. I think like a lot of times we've been able to ignore personal lives, and I'm sure you probably seen my dogs running around in the background, and like during the pandemic there was kids and there was all these different things where like personal lives and professional lives collided. And so leaders should be caring about the personal and professional life of their team members. And so that's one of the big questions that we ask about. My leader cares about me personally and professionally. My leader cares about issues that affect me, and kind of those type of questions that really get at the personal element of team members. We actually just put up our inclusion index for an award. And so if we get the award, it will be open source. So we will be sharing those questions more broadly.
Oh, wow. Well, good luck. And just so I and our listeners know, who is giving the award? Who's awarding
SIOP.
it?
Oh, it was a SIOP award that we put in
Okay.
for. Yep.
All right. Well, again, good
Yeah.
luck. And Lydiane, thanks for the question. Another question came in from Christina. How often, how many times per year do you measure inclusion?
It's a great question. So the leader accountability piece is once a year, but we ask inclusion questions throughout the year in many of our pulses. We have several pulses that we do, and we'll ask different questions here and there that focus on inclusion. It just the leader piece is only within one time in the year.
And I sense I know the answer, both given that you're up for an award and also given your background, personally. There are many vendors, and I understand why this is the case, that promote their indices and their way of measuring. Did you craft your own based on the need and desires the culture that you wanted to create, or did you take, things off the shelf to get normative data and do benchmarking and things like that? What was your approach there?
Yeah, it's a great question. So a mix of both. Dell, our team is very specific. We don't like to take anything off the shelf. We feel like we like to create things that are very specific, that amplify the voices of our team members and speak in the language that we speak in. So we did use research. We did a lot of research from like McKinsey and other different of our partnerships that we have to kind of start up with a framework. We did kind of pull from ITSG, our IT survey group benchmarking questions, and pull from Perceptics benchmarking, which is our survey vendor, pulling all of that in. But at the end of the day, it was rewriting and kind of focusing them on what makes sense for our team members. So I will say the questions we landed with won't show up probably anywhere else because they were specifically designed for us, but the research and science behind them are based on different benchmarks and frameworks.
Thank you for that. And when we talk about inclusion and not only quote unquote leading practices, but where we're going and how we're measuring inclusion, obviously networks are important, particularly with hybrid work. Are you looking at the networks, through ONA and other methods? It might be, data exhauster, using Microsoft Viva now. The names changed so much over the years, but whatever, and there's other tools that obviously that enable that. Are you looking at how people are using their time and how they're interacting with one another, or is that a beyond the bounds of what you have consciously decided to do, or is that forthcoming?
Yeah, it's a great question. We're still figuring that piece out. Not much to add there in terms of what we look at, what we don't. More so, we've been focusing on what team members tell us versus trying to monitor what they do.
Right. Yeah, no, it's a really interesting kind of quandary because we have the technical ability to do so, but is it worth it? Is it going to violate trust? And I know there's many organizations that just consciously choose not to do it, even though the capability is there. At the same time, there has been research that's been put forth that, particularly with hybrid work, and there's been minority groups or protected classes that have shrunk their networks because they become more isolated. So elevating that visibility, can there be a conscious approach to ensure people stay connected and don't get isolated? So, again, we're bumping up against the boundaries of, what's ethical, what's responsible. And so I'm just exploring with you, and I don't know where we're going to land with it. I
Yeah,
really,
yeah.
really don't, but it's,
It's been very interesting even listening to I was on a PSYOP panel to some folks talk about the difference between what do you do when you have passive data that contradicts what you're hearing and which one do you trust more. So I think the whole kind of people analytics world is figuring this piece out. It'll be interesting to see where we land. To your point on those differences in connection, I think that ties back to our hybrid myths where we actually haven't found where our team members feel differences in like attrition, promotion, connection, whether they be new hires. I think that's one of the myths that we see often is like people coming into a company will feel disconnected if they're not in an office and around people. And so we've actually been finding the opposite.
really, say more about
Mhm.
that.
Yeah, yeah. And if you go to that next slide, I'll show you kind of some of the visuals of it. So basically, what we found is, one of the myths of team members feel like new employees will feel disconnected, and so that's one of the perceptions. And our data has shown that team members feel like they belong. Those hired since March 2020 are just as likely to feel included and have strong relationships. There's also this idea of like officeism, they've been calling it, and the people that are like in an office will have greater advantages. We've actually found that like 90% of our team members say that everyone has the same opportunities to develop and learn new skills, and that our culture kind of promotes people for whether in an office or not to feel like they can advance and promote. And we actually looked at the differences between those who are fully remote and in an office to see if there were differences in promotions and advancement, and we didn't find any significant differences there.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, just to, you alluded to this earlier, given one of the questions that was posed. Even though these are quote unquote, the current state, of reality, given the data collection and analysis that you've done, I imagine you have the intention to look at this repeatedly over time to see what shifts and moves. Is that also a fair statement?
Yeah, and like I mentioned, Dell's been at this for, the last 13, 14 years, right? So this is some analysis we started years ago that we've continued to refresh over the years. We've always had a hybrid kind of flexibility workplace. So yeah, it has been a more of a longitudinal study.
Wow. So with inclusion, and I just spoke about this the other day, so I'm really curious how it works there at Dell. If
Yeah.
I go back, 20 years, and there's diversity councils, and it was normally led by one person who largely was an influencer, who frankly just did not have a lot of pull within
Mhm.
an organization. And the efforts were there, great conversations, but the systematic change did not follow in many cases. And I say that
Mhm.
compassionately. I don't say that, critically.
Yeah.
Fast forward, and particularly with the murder of George Floyd, it accelerated that, hey, we can't just pay lip service to this, that we need systems and processes and measurements that are truly going to drive meaningful change. And now there's reporting requirements that are coming out across the board that increasingly are going to reflect, DI metrics. So my
Mhm.
pointed question is, what does the governance model around diversity, equity, and inclusion look like? Like, who's your audience for these insights, and what are some of the changes that take place? And just to seed your answer, because I see implications in recruiting, learning, internal mobility, location strategy, on down the line. So what does that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, again, a lot of us are all figuring this out. I was on a call the other day with some IT folks, and we're all talking about, GDPR and all the different regulations and who can share with what and work councils. And so I think there's still a lot of work to be done on getting some of those insights all the way down the chain where people can use it. One of
Mhm.
the things we've been working on is what we call tip sheets, where we pull insights and aggregate and we kind of share these kind of tip sheets throughout the organization. We've been sending them even down to the manager level. And it's just kind of insights that we found, research that we think is helpful. One that we launched the other day was, four ways to build connection in hybrid work in a way that it is inclusive. And so sending that all the way down the chain of like, here's some four ways that gives leaders actual actionable things they can go do based on all the science and data and things we've been pulling and the research we've been pulling. And so while we're still navigating the actual kind of who can see what part of data, finding ways to still get insights to team members and leaders and through HR and through all these different systems so that they can still action on what we're seeing has been kind of our focus area.
So just to play that back, if I am a manager, I am being inundated by popular press, by social media, LinkedIn posts, all this stuff. And it is purporting what is happening with hybrid work, the risks, the opportunities, all this stuff. What you are trying to do, correct me if I'm wrong, is trying to put be the point of the spear of that narrative. I wish I had a better metaphor, but put context around that. That you might be reading this in general terms, but this is actually what's happening within the system you're in. Is that, and then hopefully that guides their decision making and behaviors moving forward. Again, is that a fair way to look at it?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think what we've been focusing on is like the key is making sure we have mechanisms and technology and data in place to quickly react to and respond to some of these hot topics in a way that amplifies the voices of our team members over the external trends. And to your point of like just a big one, right? Like quiet quitting and all these things start popping up. And so we've trying to figure out ways where we have systems in place of like, how do we talk about our team members? And quiet quitting is, everyone's been saying it's not really a thing, right? And so like how do we use our data to show how quiet quitting is not a thing and team members are really engaged and kind of debunk a lot of the myths with science and facts and get that down to our leaders in a timely manner when it matters. And so the things when the great resignation and all these things were coming out, getting kind of some insights on what's driving retention to our team members and getting that down to leaders where they can act. And so we've moved away from always saying we need a dashboard because sometimes dashboard builds, as we know, can take forever, and trying to find quicker ways to just get actionable insights down to the team members and leaders when it happens and when they need it.
Wow. So we got about 5, 10 more minutes, and I want to highlight a couple points. But before I go to this next point, I want to ask you this: if you did not do that, and this maybe take Dell out, if an organization does not do what you're just shared that you're doing, what do you think the behavior is going to be? I mean, obviously, you're all making a business decision. You're devoting your time and resources and money to generating this insight on an ongoing basis. You're doing that for a purpose, and there's some downside risk if you don't do it. What is that?
Yeah, I think downside risk is, I call it spinning. It's people start focusing on the wrong things, right? And so if they read something and they think, oh my gosh, my whole team is quiet quitting, then they start actioning and trying to figure out ways to correct quiet quitting when indeed they're focusing their time and efforts on things that are probably not even happening. And so it's loss of productivity, right? It's loss of focus. And so our goal is to answer those questions from a research and science perspective as soon as possible. That way leaders can focus on things that matter.
Well, mwah. That's a beautiful answer. Because you just communicated a business case for the work that we do.
Mm,
It's like I'm still struck by those who think this is nice to have. I mean, you think about the elevated focus and productivity across a large enterprise. I mean, to quantify that, if someone took the time to do so, is absolutely massive. Not to mention the cultural and well-being benefits that would
yes.
ensue. So this is where I want to start heading as we wrap. If an organization is going to be ebbing and flowing in terms of what hybrid works for, what means for them, given their industry, given their geography or the profile of their workforce, where would you coach them to start? And I'm specifically speaking to a people analytics leader if they're trying to garner sponsorship, like you have, as you shared before, a CHRO who kind of gets it and has commissioned this work. But if you're coaching a fellow people analytics leader who's maybe new in role, what would you say to how to get started and build a case internally to make this not only something that is done on an event-driven basis, on a one-time basis, but ongoing?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's probably not the popular opinion, but I think it's simplification, right? Like sometimes it is simply a slide. And I think we sometimes in people analytics, we overcomplicate things. I remember years ago, there was a leader that asked me, like, why do we even do engagement surveys? Like, what's the purpose of them? And I remember going back to them and I created this, it was a slide, it had like 5 points on it. And it was like, how employee engagement impacts customer net promoter score. Here's how it impacts your sales attainment. Here's how it impacts, productivity for our service workers. And it was like these 4 different slides with actual outputs. And that was all I had to send. And they were like, oh, never mind. I see how this makes a difference in attainment. I see this makes a difference in the bottom line. And so it wasn't a dashboard I created. It wasn't anything significant. It wasn't a ton of even analytics on the background, right? It was just merging some data in there and showing them something. And so I think we overcomplicate what people analytics is when sometimes leaders just need to see something very simple that says, oh, never mind, this is really important for me to focus on. So let me make sure I prioritize it. And so thinking about it in a more simplistic way about, what's going to matter, what's important, what are things people can go do. Focus on what is an action someone can take. And a lot of times they don't care about the method and the science and how we got there, even though we love it. And I want to show you how cool this R square was. They don't care. They only want to see what do they do with what we are doing. And so showing impact and driving strategy is key.
I'm smiling because that reminds me of when I was in role almost 20 years ago and created a 60-page deck, and it was damn near a dissertation. And I was all excited about scatter plots and R squares and multivariate regression. And I'm like, come on, want to tell a story, want to show your work, right? And I had a great coach, mentor, I'll call her Linda Fire-Oldroyd, who was at Gap, now at Nordstrom. And anyway, she said, no, we're going to be 10 to 12 slides, and we're actually going to flip it around. We're actually going to put the recommendations up front, and then we're going to have the supporting documentation follow, because we're probably only going to get through 4 slides, in this executive forum. And it was one of the best coaching tips that I have. And even to this day, it's part of what I put forth. They want, they, meaning executive audience, correct me if wrong, they're Dell, they want to make decisions. And there's a high level of trust that we have done our work to formulate these recommendations or put forth, our vision or the clarity of the current state, if you will, so they can then, make decisions on their own. So, I certainly celebrate that we have to simplify and keep it short and simple and to the point. So,
Absolutely.
Well, Stephanie, awesome to talk with you. We're going to do a podcast here soon. So if you're viewing this live or after the fact, look out for that soon. We're also going to be there again in Austin next week, next Wednesday night for PAFOW Connect. Extraordinarily excited. We're going to Easy Tiger East. I'm still getting used to saying that, out loud. But beyond that, beyond flying to Austin to see you next week, how can people learn more about you and what you're up to?
Yeah, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. So find me on LinkedIn. I'm always posting and stuff. And I keep any speaking engagements and things that we're doing from a Dell perspective. Those will be on there as well.
All right. Well, Stephanie, you be well. And again, look forward to seeing you next week.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Al.
Hey, thank you. Appreciate you. Be well. Bye-bye.